With winter coming to an end, the infected outside of the complex were sure to let the group know that they'd risen from their icy slumber, apparently celebrating the fact by noisily attacking each other just outside the walls. Maisie also celebrated the return of the sun by finishing up her research into microelectronics. It was an interesting topic, but it was just a stepping stone towards her ultimate goal of understanding how to build more complex vehicles to help the group leave the complex to scavenge more easily. In order to continue her research, however, Maisie would need some fancy new toys. Nyx was happy to help her build a new research bench, but suggested moving it into Maisie's bedroom. This would free up space in the dining hall for some more recreational activities, and Maisie's room was plenty big enough to house the new bench. Although they had a nice little supply of components for the new research bench, the group were sorely lacking in steel. So Maisie and Yuso headed out into the streets to keep watch over Nyx, whilst she dismantled more of the old vehicles and streetlights that littered the nearby streets. They worked late into the night and managed to gather together a decent little stockpile of steel chunks for them to melt down. With the warmth of the summer sun had come a massive explosion of fungal growth across the city, including in the second courtyard of the complex. Annette made plans to chop back the worst of it. It could in theory serve as good grazing fodder for the yak, however it also limited the group's line of sight, making it easier for any rogue infected to sneak up on them, which they had no interest in entertaining. Summer also brought with it new travellers. The first group to arrive seemed to have little interest in actually trading with the group, but it was nice for the group just to see other friendly faces, and know that they weren't the last uninfected humans on the planet's surface. Yuso spent the next day processing the steel they'd collected, but despite their initial elation at the amount they'd managed to collect, it turned out they didn't quite have enough to finish off their research bench. It's unclear if it was caused by the news of the smaller than expected steel haul, or just the general situation, but whatever the reason, Maisie suffered from a panic attack that day, and spent the rest of it hiding in her room. In the interest of preparing for their eventual vehicle, and also clearing out the horrid little room that they'd been storing the barrels of feces in, Annette suggested that they start processing the fecal sludge at their refinery to produce some chem fuel, which could be used for a number of things, including powering their vehicles. With Maisie still hiding in her room, the rest of the group wanted to leave her to recover on her own time. So instead of heading out to scavenge more steel with one less person to watch her back, Nyx suggested that she and Yuso begin clearing out more of the rooms off the western courtyard of the complex. The first room didn't contain much, but its proximity to the garage would make it the ideal area to store their new chem fuel supply. Once they'd bricked up the door, pulled up the wooden flooring, and added a new granite door leading directly to the garage, it would be the perfect storage location for the highly flammable chemical. Even if some accident did cause it to ignite, the fire would be contained by the all-stone room. With the infected waking up from their hibernation, it wasn't long before one was bashing on the doors of the complex. Thankfully a number of the group were in the area working on the garage, so were able to hightail it to the embrasures and put the infected down before it could burst through the doors. That night, the team began their vehicle production efforts in earnest, with Annette producing some parts on the workbench, whilst Maisie refined some of the fecal sludge into chem fuel. The next morning saw almost the whole crew pitching in to help feed the children in the classroom. It wasn't exactly how Nyx and Maisie had pictured their apocalypse looking prior to meeting Annette, but they were quite happy with the way things had turned out. With Maisie back on her feet, the next morning, Nyx, Yuso and Maisie all headed back out onto the street to scavenge up more steel. However, things didn't quite go according to plan. Within seconds of leaving the gates of the complex, a number of aggressive infected began swarming towards them. As they focused their attentions on the approaching infected, even the cam infected behind them suddenly turned on them, trying to take a bite out of them. They were able to put down the infected behind them, but whilst they had their backs turned, the other four had closed the distance. Deciding they'd rather handle this with the advantage of their defences, the three of them retreated back into the complex, where they could take shots at the infected through the embrasures as they were being held at bay by the gates. Unfortunately, the gates were still in poor condition after the previous attack, and one of them soon fell, causing the defenders to retreat to a safer distance to fire upon the infected. After they downed it, Yuso moved to finish off the infected, intending to clear its corpse out of the way so that they could rebuild the gate. However, as soon as she approached, 3 more infected began dashing towards her. She pulled back once more, and, hearing all of the commotion, Annette also came out to lend a hand to the group. Thankfully they were able to take them all down before they got close enough to infect any of the group, but the sudden full-scale assault had shaken them. Whilst Nyx went to grab the materials to rebuild the destroyed gate, Maisie kept watch for any more infected, and Yuso risked a lung infection wading through the clouds of spores that had been released from the bodies in order to repair the remaining gate, to ensure that it could hold if more infected arrived soon. The group managed to rebuild the gates without further incident, but by the time they finished it was already the early evening and the shadows were getting longer. Scavenging more steel could wait until the sun returned and their nerves calmed a little. Although the hope is that the natural growth in the western courtyard will be enough to feed the yak during the summer, Annette decides to plant a field of hay grass. It will provide the yak something else to graze on, and if they manage to get a harvest in before winter, then they can use that to feed the yak during the winter, saving the more human-friendly mushrooms for themselves. And, in the interest of ensuring that the yak don't keep munching away on the group's stockpiled food, they temporarily brick over the animal entrance into the walk-in freezer. The next morning, Nyx, Maisie and Yuso all head out to scavenge up the required steel once more. This time they're relatively unharassed by the infected, allowing Nyx to work away for a good number of hours whilst the other two ferry the materials back to the complex. By the early afternoon they've returned to the complex victorious, sporting a large haul of steel chunks for Yuso to begin processing. That night, as they're going about their business, another drop pod lands in the city, but this time it lands directly in the centre of the eastern courtyard. After a brief examination to confirm that the sword writhing in pain on the ground is not in fact infected, the group decide to help him. His name is Farash, and he's unfortunately hostile to the group. They decide to sequester him away in their makeshift jail while they nurse him back to health, and hopefully, over time, they can convince him to join them in their efforts to survive this apocalyptic wasteland. As the group rest that night, they realise that the sound of the infected attacking and feasting upon each other just beyond the walls have become the standard sound of the night that they've all become accustomed to. Well, all except perhaps their new prisoner. Locked in his dark little cell, Farash might understandably think that the whole complex was being raided by the infected, given the noises coming from outside his room. In contrast to Farash's presumed horror, the children were beginning to mature, and, that night, they managed to climb out of their cribs, make their way past their sleeping mother and into the dining hall and help themselves to their first unaided meals. A little 1 AM snack to introduce them to solid foods. Upon waking in the morning to find that her children had suddenly outgrown their cribs, Annette decided that it was time to decide upon names for them. Nyx had already started referring to one of the children, her favourite one, although Annette didn't plan to share that fact with the kids, Jubilee, and in honour of the bonds they now shared, Annette decided that this should be the child's given name. She named the other two Amelia and Connor, and with that, the complex now had 3 children roaming the grounds. Children who wasted no time in drawing all over the floors of the complex. Yuso made quick work of dismantling the kids' old cribs, so that they could be replaced with real beds. The day rolled by quickly for the group, as they each busied themselves with tasks, whilst also taking some time to interact with the children, even teaching them a little about the tasks they were doing along the way. It was quite a novelty to have the children wandering around, expressing their curiosity for all the goings on around the complex. Of course, the infected were not willing to give the group the day to enjoy this new development, but Annette was also not willing to let them ruin the day. And, as one began bashing on the gate outside, Annette took a break from chatting to Farash to go outside and blast the infected's brain out. Hell, she even took out a couple extra, just for good measure. Aside from that, the day went by without further incident, with Yuso smelting the steel, Annette building the vehicle components, Maisie refining the chem fuel, and the kids traipsing around, watching it all unfold. The next day also saw the start of a slightly more formal classroom lesson for the kids. Annette was trying to get them to develop an interest in topics that would be useful around the complex, such as construction. This may seem like a product of the circumstances in which they were born, but in fairness, had they been born on the farm, they likely would have been schooled in very practical pursuits anyway, so that they could help with the farming duties once they were a bit older. With the constant attacks on the gates, Maisie considered switching her focus away from vehicles for the time being in order to begin researching how to make automated machine gun turrets. The gates weren't super strong, and the group didn't have infinite resources to be able to keep replacing them. If someone was near the gates when the infected started attacking, then they could easily take them down. But the issue was, the longer it took somebody to get there, the more damage the infected could do, and the more the risk was of them completely destroying the gates. If the group could put together some automated turrets at the gates to complement their CCTV, then this could solve the problem for them. Although the group had been growing microthread mushrooms to allow them to tailor their own clothing, Annette figured they should take advantage of the summer heat and the spare room in the western courtyard to plant some cotton too. It wouldn't hurt to have the additional resources to make clothes from, especially with the kids now requiring clothing too, and the whole group likely to need new, warmer gear once winter rolled around again. The next day, some of the group ventured out once more, and were greeted almost immediately by aggressive infected. Putting them down quickly, the group continued on their mission. They were determined to scour the city for any other chunks of the spacecraft that Nyx had previously managed to liberate a lot of components from. The construction of their new vehicle would require a lot of them, and they were already running low. Thankfully, the group were able to find a number of other chunks that had fallen from the ship, scattered across the city. Arriving at each, Nyx made quick work of pulling them apart. They did have to deal with the occasional aggressive infected along the way, but thankfully nothing quite as intense as the previous days. After covering most of the city, they each carried armfuls of components and steel back to the complex. It was a wonderful haul, only soured by the knowledge that they'd now searched all over the city, and were confident there were no further ship chunks in the area. If they needed more components in the future, they would need to venture further afield to retrieve them. As they were returning to the complex with their haul, Yuso, clearly away in a daydream, accidentally stumbled directly into the path of an aggressive infected. The infected immediately took a swipe at her face, cracking her jaw. In a state of shock and fear, Yuso began running back towards the complex as quick as she could, while Maisie and Nyx, who had just been a few steps behind her and had witnessed the whole event, began firing upon the infected. Unperturbed by Maisie and Nyx's gunfire, the infected gave chase to Yuso, dashing after her. Thankfully, Yuso's fear-driven sprint got her back to the complex before the infected could catch her, and Maisie and Nyx made short work of putting down the infected before returning themselves. The group were more confident in their understanding of the infection now, so after Annette examined Yuso's jaw, they were all quite confident the skin hadn't been broken and she hadn't been infected, much to everyone's relief. Yuso would struggle to eat for a few days until her jaw had recovered a little, but considering how close she'd come to infection, she couldn't bring herself to be too sad about her eating difficulties. With the steel and components they'd brought back, Nyx was finally able to spend the night putting together Maisie's new research bench. Maisie's joy was twofold, as after the events of today, she was quite looking forward to having an excuse to hide away in her room, away from the dangers of the world. The next day started out blessedly calm in comparison to the previous one, with Annette and Nyx working together to bring in a new harvest of mushrooms and working to replant the grow rooms afterwards. Maisie was working away on how to make gun turrets, feeling somewhat more motivated after the previous day. The kids played and learned together in their room, and Yuso had a long lie, in an effort to give her body the rest it needed to help mend her jaw. Having been the only one to avoid the adventure yesterday, Annette felt it only right that she dealt with the infected when they came knocking. For today at least, the rest of the group had earned a day off from dealing with them. That night, as thunder rumbled overhead, the group got together in Annette's room to enjoy a small party to celebrate their recent successes, in an attempt to offset the stress of the previous day. The next night, the group were rudely ripped out of their happiness as a group of uninfected attackers approached the city. They'd clearly heard tell of the complex and decided they wanted it for themselves. The group could hear them in the distance, blasting a path directly to the complex through other buildings. The group initially hoped that the infected in the city might handle the issue for them, but as the explosions got closer, they began to realise that they would have to deal with this themselves. Not wanting to let the attackers blast a hole in the side of the complex that they simply didn't have the resources to patch up, the group decided to venture out into the city to engage the attackers on the streets. With Maisie and Yuso having shotguns, they took up forward positions, with Maisie concealed in a room just off the road, aiming to lure out the attackers before revealing herself and attacking. Unfortunately, the grenade-wielding attacker had clearly seen her sneak into the room, and his first grenade flew directly towards her. It was stopped by the wall, of course, but when it did blow up, it took a huge chunk out of the wall, allowing his teammates to shoot through the gap and hit the now trapped Maisie. In an attempt to flee, Maisie began trying to tear down the wall in the room, to give her an exit through the adjoining room. Thankfully, the noise the attackers had been making had attracted some infected, forcing the attackers to turn their back on the group momentarily in order to deal with the infected, giving the group a great opportunity to hit them hard. Nex, along with being blinded by a flashbang, also took a nasty shot. After their bloodlust for Maisie causes them to blast the door off the room she's hiding in, one of the attackers, angered by their failure to kill her so far, rushes into the room, axe in hand, and swings at her, knocking her down just moments before she manages to get through the wall to her freedom. He then makes a beeline for Yuso, managing to land one hit before Nex sends a bullet right through the attacker's skull, ending him instantly. With most of the attackers down, Annette and Yuso advance on the last hostile hiding in a room down the street, whilst Nyx rushes into the room Maisie's in, looking to offer her some help. While Nyx carries a heavily injured Maisie back to the complex, Maisie and Yuso strip the attackers of anything valuable they had on them, before heading back to tend to their wounds. Nyx manages to get Maisie into her bed, but decides they'd be best to wait and let Annette treat her wounds, as Nyx has no idea where to even begin. Maisie is in a bad way, with many small injuries from the gunfire riddling her body. Despite how it looks, however, Maisie is actually incredibly lucky. Despite the amount of bullets that were fired at and hit her, the majority had only grazed her, not doing deep damage. The biggest danger to her was blood loss, which over the course of a number of hours, Annette was able to get under control by rigorously sewing up the wounds. The group rests for the night and have a slow start the next day, letting everyone slowly ease themselves back into a functional existence after the hardships of the day before. Looking to make themselves useful in the safest and calmest way possible, Nyx and Yuso continue their efforts to open up more rooms in the complex, gaining access to two small, empty rooms on the south side of the western courtyard. The next day, in an effort to get enough steel to finish up their vehicle, the group head out into the streets to the south of the complex, with Annette taking up guard duties this time to allow Maisie to stay home researching and not exacerbating her wounds. In order to speed up the process a little, Yuso also begins dismantling some of the vehicles. She's come far under Nyx's tutelage, and is quite effective at construction tasks these days, and the quicker they get back, the less chance that something goes wrong. It's a long but blessedly uneventful day, which effectively manages to refill their steel stockpiles. Nyx and Annette finish out the day teaching some lessons to Jubilee and Amelia, although they do both have very different approaches in their lessons. The next day, eager to ensure that they can produce their own clothing, the group use the last of their wood to build a tailoring bench. For lack of a better location, they decide to place it in the dining hall for the time being. Given that gun handling has been one of the earliest lessons the group have taught the kids, Nyx suggests giving each of the children a gun. Annette is incredibly determined to ensure the survival of her family, and as such she's easily swayed by Nyx's argument that if things go badly wrong, the kids need a way to defend themselves from the infected. Despite handing the children a bunch of guns, the next few days are actually quite quiet and devoid of any incidents. With all the resources they've gathered and the time they've had to work away, Annette finally finishes producing the last parts for their vehicle, and Nyx gets to work assembling it. After months of work, they finally managed to build, from scratch, a vehicle of Maisie's own design. It's a small, lightly armoured vehicle with a machine gun turret mounted on it. In honour of its intended purpose, Maisie names it the Scavenger. Although it won't be able to carry a massive load, it will allow the group to be relatively safe as they venture out into the city or further afield, whilst also allowing them to haul a relatively decent amount of scavenged materials back to the complex. In the interest of opening a way out of the complex for the Scavenger, as well as improving their stockpile of bricks for any future construction projects, Nyx and Yuso begin to pull down the walls of the two small rooms on the south of the western courtyard, allowing them to add an external door that can be used to take the vehicles in and out of the complex. That night, high on the success of creating the Scavenger, the last thing the group expected was another tragedy. Their prisoner, Farash, had managed to jimmy open the lock on his cell and was loose in the complex. The group were hopeful they could bring him back alive and convince him to join them. Annette heads out to the west of the cell to cover that side, and, seeing her, Farash dashes back through to the other side of his cell. Unfortunately for him, Nyx and Maisie are waiting for him. Startled by seeing Farash charging through the door directly towards them, Maisie and Nyx both pull the trigger, tearing Farash apart and ending his life immediately. It was a sad outcome, but they all took solace in the fact that Farash hadn't managed to injure any of the group in his escape attempt. In potentially even more horrifying news, the crisp frost in the air that night signals to Annette that they've already blown through summer and winter is once again on the horizon. To this end, she elects to start harvesting all of the remaining outdoor crops early the next day. Despite how horrifyingly quickly winter rolled around again, Annette's confident she can get some rice, cotton and hay out of the ground and into storage before things get too bad outside. With winter arriving, it might be the perfect time to go scavenging further afield, since the infected are likely to slow down again. With that in mind, the group attach a garage door to the outer perimeter of the complex, giving the Scavenger a way out into the world. The next morning, despite an eclipse limiting their vision, Nyx and Yuso jump in the Scavenger, ready to set off on an adventure. Annette sees them out, ensuring that the door is closed firmly behind them. Setting off to the east, they hope to investigate rumours of an old complex that was dedicated to research, just outside the city limits. It sounds like exactly the kind of place where one could hope to find copious amounts of steel and components. Arriving just a short few hours later, some initial recon suggests that whatever once stood here suffered some serious damage. Back when the infection first broke out, large fires broke out at multiple complexes all across the city, and with no one there to fight the fires, they caused a lot of destruction. It looked as though this complex had suffered a similar fate. Despite the destruction, Yuso was confident they could salvage some useful materials from the area. Nyx parked the Scavenger up near the first buildings of the complex, and the two of them got to work disassembling anything nearby that looked to have an ounce of tech in it, as well as anything they thought would be helpful back at the base. Clearing out the first building, they repositioned the Scavenger closer to the centre mass of the complex. They would spend the night sleeping in the Scavenger, and once the sun came up, they would set about liberating the steel and components there too. Back in the city, Annette was thankfully on hand to deal with a rowdy infected, but unfortunately she wasn't quick enough to stop it from destroying the gate into the complex. With both of their construction experts out on the mission, it was left to Maisie to try and piece together how to build a new gate. She decided that wood would be the easiest, so went ahead with that, despite knowing how weak it would be at keeping out the infected. She would just have to get Nyx to fix it once she returned, but it would hold for now. Back on the outskirts of town, Nyx and Maisie were making quick work of pulling apart a mixture of technical workbenches and heaters. They also found a lot of food which had survived the fire, and seemingly thanks to the winter, hadn't yet perished. After dragging all of their new resources close to the Scavenger, they found themselves in the difficult position of trying to decide what to take and what to leave. The Scavenger was great at keeping them safe and getting them places fast, but its carrying capacity left a little to be desired, so there was no way they could take everything. They'd already gathered up some components and a poker table from the first building, and in the end they decided to take the additional components, a machining table, some clothing, a couple of good quality chairs for the dining hall, a pile of jade that they thought might be worth trading, and as much herbal medicine as they could fit in the Scavenger. It was a wonderful haul, and they were very excited to get it back to the city, but they were also very aware of the fact they were leaving behind a decent stockpile of usable steel, along with months worth of food. They may have to come up with a new solution to ensure that they weren't letting any resources go to waste if they were to go on more of these missions. But with that, they headed home, considering their first excursion outside of the city limits to have been a resounding success. Arriving at the complex, Annette let them in, and they unloaded their haul in the garage. The next day, Yuso used some of the Molotov cocktails they'd brought back from the excursion to try and clear up some of the bodies that had built up outside the complex. They were a pretty ghastly sight, and probably a hazard too, so a little fire seemed like a good call. While the fires raged, Nix and Yuso cut their way into some more of the buildings surrounding the western courtyard, intent on finally gaining access to all of them. Given their previous experience, they didn't expect to find much of use, but at least securing the rooms gave them options on how to utilise the space. It's not long before Maisie's flimsy wooden door is bashed down by an infected, and Yuso narrowly avoids taking another hit from them. With the help of the legendary gunslinger Annette, they're able to take down the infected before it can corner Yuso and take another swing. With Nix looking to find space for the new poker table in the dining hall, the group decide it's finally time to remove the smelter and the sewing table. Now that the complex was better established, they could find new locations for these, and let the dining hall be an area of food and recreation. As the best crafter, they put the sewing machine in Annette's room, whilst the smelter gets relocated to the northern airlock, where there's an abundance of space. With the gates still being regularly assaulted, Nix is determined to update their defences. To achieve this, she'll need additional bricks though, so together with Yuso, they begin dismantling some of the walls in the new rooms they've uncovered. With those bricks not proving to be quite enough however, they tear down another wall, and, with sadness in their heart, tear up the fancy stone flooring in one of the rooms they found, in order to repurpose the bricks. With the bricks obtained, Nix plans out another series of embrasures, and a second set of doors into the complex. This way, they can still see out with the CCTV, and if an infected starts to attack the gates, the group will have plenty of time to reach the defences and take them down before they actually get into the complex, as any attackers will now need to work their way through two separate doors. As the group sleep that night, a frost descends upon the city once more. They're well and truly in winter once again. This time though, they have plenty of heat sources, plenty of food stockpiled, and even have the fabrics required to produce extra clothing if they need the additional warmth. Things are certainly looking better for them this year than they were the previous one. The group start the first day of frost by putting down an infected bashing at the doors. So just a standard day for them at this point. Perhaps less standard is the arrival of a group of uninfected travellers at the entrance to the complex, who look to have something to trade. Annette ventures out to greet them, and along with some of the silver they have stockpiled, trades them a bunch of the excess weaponry the group have lying around, in exchange for some medicine. Later that day, Nix and Yuso make the momentous achievement of finally gaining access to all of the rooms of the expanded complex. A longer process than anyone had initially envisaged, but a good one to have completed nonetheless. With the kids already feeling the cold, probably part of their sordid blood, Annette planned to make each of them a little parka to help fend off the cold, and finally put their microthread fibres to use. With the growing rooms providing plenty of food, and the extra space in the western courtyard available for farming if required, Yuso suggests extending the northern airlock to include Maisie's room, and even the battery/utility room, to help the complex maintain better temperatures all around. With the airlock extended, Yuso also made the wild suggestion of finally adding a second toilet, just so that there weren't queues forming each morning with all 7 of the group trying to get access to relieve themselves. A few days later, with winter now in full effect, the group decided it was a good time for Nyx and Yuso to venture out of the city once more. With the cold arriving, most of the infected would be incapacitated, so they could theoretically move around a bit more freely out there. They were heading out to investigate an old mining site in the mountains, about half a day's drive from the city. One of the travellers they'd encountered mentioned it, and said there might be some valuable stuff there if they could get to it. The Scavenger arrived at the site that evening. Yuso and Nyx had been hoping to get some sleep before exploring the site in the morning, but as they started to notice signs of recent activity, they decided to move around the outskirts of the site and take a closer look. Approaching from the south, Yuso is still alert enough to see a group of uninfected humans rush towards the Scavenger with their weapons drawn. From her position in the gunner's seat, she trains the Scavenger's machine guns on them and opens fire. Struggling to see what's going on in the darkness, Nyx starts driving in circles, hoping to at least confuse the enemy and, if she's lucky, maybe run a few of them down with the vehicle. It's a confusing and disorienting few minutes, but after a moment Yuso reports back that there doesn't seem to be any further movement, and a deathly silence falls over the area. Nyx parks up the Scavenger and they hop out to have a look. The area looks like it was once abandoned, but it seems that these people have taken up shelter here recently, and were none too friendly to outsiders, to their own detriment in the end. Nyx and Yuso hunker down in one of the buildings to get some shut-eye, deciding that they can start scavenging in earnest the next day. They spend the next day pulling apart anything of value, although there isn't much to be found. As night descends and they start thinking about leaving, a pair of wolves emerge from the shadows with hunger in their eyes. The 2 of them escape into the shallow water nearby, hoping it will slow the wolves long enough for them to get a few shots off. One manages to get close enough to take a bite out of Yuso, but they put it down soon after, with the second one not even getting close. Tending to Yuso's wound, they pack up the Scavenger with a spare battery, a massive pile of components and as much steel as it can carry, and head off back to the city. This time, upon their arrival, they park the Scavenger in the vehicle bay near the outer wall, leaving the garage open for future projects. And speaking of future projects, Maisie finishes up one of her most anticipated projects yet, the multi-analyzer. Once they build one of these, she's confident she can figure out all manner of new technologies. And all they need to build it is some plasteel and some gold. Should be easy. Right? Good morning, afternoon or night, depending on when you're watching this. Thank you for watching to the end of the video. I appreciate you, and I hope you appreciate the little story we have going on here. I just wanted to drop in at the end here to remind you to subscribe to be kept up to date on when the next episode drops, and to say I hope things are going well for you. And if they aren't going well at the moment, please believe that things will get better. Until my next installment of Rimworld silliness, take care of yourself. Bye bye.